We can discuss this story now with Lyal S. Sunga, who's a visiting professor of international relations and global politics at the American University of Rome. It's very nice to speak to you. It's a shame, though, the story we have to discuss. And we heard that the UN is concerned from that statement that was just read out. Amnesty International have accused Italy, other EU governments, of supporting a system where migrants are detained and abused. Do you think it's a fair allegation?
You know, for me, it's a little bit, perhaps, it sounds to me like an overstatement because, first of all, you know, I think they mentioned torture and abuse. These things are definitely happening. And the people that are first and foremost responsible are the human traffickers, and Libya has the main responsibility in shutting this down and to control it. But we know that Libya is in a fragile situation. So realistically speaking, we have to admit that Italy and the EU has to be very vigilant in making sure that they do not refoul, which means to turn back asylum seekers back to a place where they could be maltreated, and that in this case would be Libya. So I wouldn't say necessarily that they're complicit directly in the abuse. I think that may be a little bit unfair. What I would say, however, is that Italy, which has been enormously generous. I mean, they've taken in already, I think, 165,000 migrants this year up till now. Many other countries have just closed their borders completely to migrants. So, Italy has been very, very generous and has shown a very high level of solidarity with asylum seekers and economic migrants as well. But it's no good if people are, facing all sorts of abuse, and that's clearly been happening. So the solution to this is to have an EU, wide solution that is in great solidarity with Italy and supports Italy in its efforts. And that means not to turn people back and to make sure that they can make an asylum claim and to sort out between economic migrants who don't have the same rights as refugees. And refugees are persons who are facing a well-founded fear of persecution. So there is a refugee determination process that has to be followed under international law, and Italy has to be very vigilant to make sure that unintentionally or intentionally it is, feeding into a system of abuse. So there's a definite concern there. It was a concern that was raised by the UN Committee Against Torture in Geneva just back November 17th that said something's not working with the Italian agreement with the Libyan government, and Italy has to do more, go beyond denunciations of what's happening in Libya and see whether it can pressure the Libyan authorities to ensure that people are not maltreated.
You mentioned that the use of the term complicit. I'm interested, what do you think is really going on? Would it be fair to say perhaps that the Italian government is turning a blind eye to what is happening? How would you assess their involvement, and to what extent do they have an obligation to ensure the human rights of these refugees?
Well, we can't lump everybody as refugees. There are refugees and there are economic migrants, and they have different rights. And also the definition of refugee is narrower. That's the way it's used by European countries and also in North America than in Africa and Latin America. For example, in Africa and the Latin American countries, anybody fleeing from generalized violence or a natural disaster or war should be classed as a refugee in their reading. Intergovernmental consensus on that definition. Whereas the classical definition from the 1951 Refugee Convention and the 1967 Protocol is that it's a person facing a well-founded fear of persecution, which implies some sort of being specifically targeted. So first of all, there's a difference in the interpretation of what is a refugee. UNHCR recommends that all countries broaden their definition because people that are facing serious generalized violence or war situations are in a very similar situation to persons facing a well-founded fear of persecution under the classical definitions. Very hard to distinguish.
Sorry to interrupt you, Lyal. I just wanted to get back to the point, though. Do you think that the Italian officials are aware that there are some abuses taking place and are just taking no action over it, or do you think that they're absolutely ignorant to what's happening?
No, it's really hard for me to say that they're absolutely ignorant, or that they, or I wouldn't say that they're complicit. I think if, they cannot be held responsible for everything that goes on in Libya. On the other hand, if you're getting a number of reports from credible sources, including UN agencies, that there are systematic abuses, that is, and I think it's clear that there are, Italy has to then, and the European Union has to say, well, we're not going to send these people back to Libya, and we're going to find some way to give them a safe haven, whether or not they are economic migrants or refugees, and try to help with the resettlement. So blind eye may be what we're seeing, more than complicity, and it's not exactly the same thing. Italy has been, as I've said, very, very generous, and I think they're getting a little bit desperate without the proper EU support. Having said that, there have been negotiations in Tallinn, and I understand that the EU and Italy have an agreement which has not quite in force yet, but which I think will become operational, whereby the EU will give much more support to Italy. But it raises another issue, is that the EU shouldn't be trying to basically allowing its border decisions to be made by the Libyan authorities either, in effect extending the European Union border security to the Libyan territory, because that's also not correct.
So Italy seems to be in an almost impossible situation. Pressure from some parts of the EU not to let migrants in, and pressure from others to let them in. And to have them sort of incorporated within the borders of the EU. If you could start this whole system from scratch, what would be your best way of dealing with the matter?
I think it would have been better not to have the NATO intervention in Libya the way it went. And I know the Russian Federation and China are still feeling very resentful for what happened there, because the original mandate under the UN Security Council resolution way back in 2011 was protection of civilians and use of force for protection of civilians. And you just had a broadcast just now on the illegal invasion of Iraq back in 2003 by George Bush. I mean, it's not right that countries, major powers, destabilize a situation and then later on complain that there are mass migration movements from war and other difficulties. So the whole world will have to join together, first of all, not to use force in an indiscriminate manner or in ill-advised ways, and then also to join with countries to build capacity and have fair trade relations, and to make sure that people have job opportunities, etc. Because a lot of people, I mean, they take enormous risks to cross the Mediterranean. So many deaths have happened, and they wouldn't be leaving unless the situation is very dire. So whether it's an economic situation or whether it's from, the classical refugee, well-founded fear of persecution situation. So it means much more engagement between rich and poor countries, and also not mucking around, throwing bombs and trying to bomb places into democracy and human rights and the rule of law. It has to be done in partnership, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law with the countries, and not in such a reckless manner as we saw in Libya and some certain other places in the Middle East and North Africa.
Lyal, much appreciate you coming on RT. Some fascinating points you made there. Lyal S. Sunga is my guest, visiting professor of international relations and global politics at the American University of Rome. Thank you, Lyal.
It's been a pleasure, Neil.